So the biggest promise, I think, is that it might enable us to make people more free.
I think the biggest promise of the neuroscience of free will is that we can start to bring in contact our age-old philosophical thinking about free will with interesting experimental data.
Well, the biggest promise would, of course, be if we could determine whether we have a free will or not.
The real excitement of a neuroscience of free will at the moment is to understand what it is that our minds supply for our behavior. We're not merely reflex organisms. And that's a new perspective in mind sciences, and I think it's an exciting one.
The real promise lies in understanding the relationship between minds and brains.
This will have a tremendous impact on our legal system, on our social interactions, on clinical conditions such as addiction and other disorders of volition and free will, and also in how we think about ourselves, and even in artificial intelligence and how to design robots and sentient systems who are morally responsible.
To me, it's a great area that brings together our scientific attempts to understand the world and a more humanistic vision, and in particular our understanding of ourselves.
The biggest promise is the bringing of the data discovered by scientists into the field where the problems have been discussed very abstractly.
I think free will is not a single notion. I think it's a whole array of different notions. And I think we've tried to tease those apart philosophically, and I think we've tried to tease them apart with psychology. And I think now neuroscience is going to come in and help us complete that picture.
We can reconsider that question and actually open this whole field of research up again and say it has not been resolved, free will has not been disproven.
Conceptual clarity, I think, is one thing that we're lacking a bit, especially in neuroscience. So we don't agree on what free will is. I think by working together with philosophers, we'll have a better idea conceptually of what free will is, and that will make it more feasible for us to actually do experiments.
I think the biggest problem in trying to study the neuroscience of free will is we can't use our conventional scientific methods. So normally in science, when you want to study something, you treat the thing that you're studying as a black box, and you manipulate the inputs and you measure the outputs. And the whole idea about, quote, free will, unquote, is that our actions are up to us. They're not driven by any external input. They're not driven by the environment. So what that means is that you don't have an input that you can easily manipulate. And that means that you can't use the standard method of studying the mind as a black box. So we lack good methods for understanding how volition, I'm not sure I like the term free will, but how volition works. And I think the biggest challenge right now is coming up with convincing and rigorous scientific methods.
I think the greatest challenges are probably deciding exactly what we want to test, what theses or propositions we want to test, and then how to test them.
Some of the answers about volition may be uncomfortable. It may be hard for us to accept that we're nothing but a pack of neurons, that our volition is purely and completely dictated by physical phenomena and by neuronal interactions.
Well, I think it's the greatest challenge is perhaps the so-called hard problem of consciousness.
There obviously are ways that we can study it. In my view, again, it's a brain state, and we should be able to understand brain states. But exactly how the brain state translates into something that we can be aware of is a very difficult matter.
I think one big challenge is just getting neuroscientists and philosophers together. They often mean totally different things by intention or by belief or by action. And sometimes you're just talking past each other.
People who talk in terms of these concepts don't really understand that the terms that they're using don't have any clear meaning.
Philosophy and neuroscience have very, very different traditions, very different vocabularies, and they often do not translate into each other.
I think it is to link the different levels of understanding from what happens at the neuronal level to the network level and to the mental level.
Because it's hard. These are different disciplines. It takes a lot of time and effort for people from different disciplines to really work together.
Being able to define operationally what is free will, so that we can study it empirically.
I think the greatest challenge is that we need to resist the temptation to oversimplify.
The biggest challenge is probably communication between neuroscientists and philosophers. Neuroscientists tackle these problems largely by thinking about what they can measure, and they want to set aside discussion of qualities and properties of people that they can't measure, that they have no idea how to measure, where philosophers think very openly and freely about what kinds of properties people ordinarily think their actions have, and they don't worry about whether or not those are properties that they can measure. So trying to kind of translate and find common ground, turning philosophical concepts into ones that are actually operationalizable is very difficult and a major challenge for the field, I think.
So the idea of free will must in some way be embedded in the brain. And we have a lot of good tools now for studying the brain. We can do EEG studies, we can do fMRI studies. There are a whole variety of ways that we can get some sense about how the brain is actually processing things that will in fact relate to free will. So I think that is an aspect which makes it more tractable to understand than perhaps some other features of consciousness.
Well, directly I don't think it can be. So I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done, careful conceptual work, before we can start to design sensible experiments that tell us something about the nature of free will.
That's always with these things. It's something where you have some results that you think might bear on something, and then you work back again. So it's a sort of process of triangulation, I think, between philosophers, psychologists, neuroscientists, to come up with the right ways of addressing the questions.
So I think this is indeed one of the greatest challenges, how to take this concept or this term and try to break it into smaller questions and how to formalize it in empirical ways. What we try to do in our work is to focus on deliberate or meaningful decisions, so not decisions that are completely random or arbitrary and have little bearing on what we do in everyday lives. So we try to examine the question of volition by focusing on typical decisions that you might have made, in a typical day.
Well, you can bring free will down to earth. So imagine you think it's the ability to act freely, and then imagine that you had some definition of free action. And if you had a definition of free action of a certain kind, you could figure out a way to test whether we ever do that kind of thing, whether we act freely.
The more you can predict human behavior from physical antecedent conditions, the better the evidence is that human actions are determined.
I think the right way to go about this is to really try to make sure that the concepts that we're studying are the concepts that make sense to study. The kind of experiments that we're doing are not just well controlled, but they're also asking the right question, that if we get a specific answer to that question, it would not just convince neuroscientists, but actually convince philosophers that we have made some progress in the field.
Well, I think that first we have to find a sort of a neural correlate of free will or conscious free will.
It actually means different things. If we want to understand what causes wills, then we have to get causal relations. That means we have to manipulate things.
So I think the biggest challenge in trying to produce experimental studies of free will is trying to combine in a single experiment all the different things that people want out of a theory of volition and a theory of free will. So in philosophy, for example, people always say, oh, voluntary actions are the actions that you make for a reason. So we need to have a reason why somebody would make a movement or make an action during an experiment. And in neurophysiology, we say that the critical thing about a voluntary action is the particular brain circuits that trigger the muscle contraction that make us move. And I think one of the real difficulties for producing experiments is getting all of these different elements which seem to contribute to what we mean by volition into a single experiment. All we can do at the moment is design an experiment which addresses some of what we mean by free will, but perhaps not everything.
Well, I already mentioned the difficulty of getting them to talk to each other, so now I'll add another difficulty, and that is getting them to agree on the same standards. Neuroscientists say a paper's not good unless it has this and this and this and this and this. And the philosophers say, oh, no, no, no. For a paper to be good, it's got to have these other things, you know, that and that and that and that and that. And so they need to agree on what's going to be a good paper, what's going to be a good experiment, or they're not going to both be invested in it and they're not going to be able to work together.
The advantage of bringing both philosophers and neuroscientists into conversation with one another is that each can discipline the other. I think philosophers can bring to the table an understanding of the richness of the phenomena, so to help keep neuroscientists from oversimplification of what it is that they're trying to study, and neuroscientists bring a kind of hard physical science discipline to the study of these questions.
I mean, the advantages are obvious, that you can really start to look at the mechanisms that are there. And I think sometimes we find when we look for the mechanisms that they're actually completely unlike we thought. So we're just wrong about how human beings work.
I'm very, very excited about the possibility of interacting with philosophers. I'm a physicist turned neuroscientist. There are about 5 decades that I need to catch up with in terms of understanding neuroscience. And there are 5 centuries, if not 5 millennia of the history of philosophy. So I think that collaborating and working alongside with philosophers is very important.
If one wants to study free will, one better know the philosophical debates and arguments around this issue. This is a specific topic where you want to collaborate with philosophers because of the major conceptual issues that are at play here. And for philosophers as well, I think that in this day and age, you can do philosophy of volition without knowing neuroscience, but that would limit your scope tremendously.
Well, one of the advantages is really that you're able to do a division of labor. So good philosophers who know a lot about free will can help at that end of things, sort of the conceptual end of things, the history of the subject. And good neuroscientists who know a lot about neuroscience can help to design studies that can give us information about things we want to know.
One, which I thought was evident from today's session, is getting people to use the same terms to mean the same things. So today we heard people talking about intentions as forward-looking, but agency as backward-looking. That was a thing that one of the experimenters said. That's a completely new use of those terms to me. And there's a couple other things that even just being on the same page and understanding one another seems like a challenge.
Philosophers, in my experience, first of all, to make clear, I'm a neuroscientist on that side of the issue, but collaborating with philosophers, I think, is extremely valuable in terms of asking good questions. In order to understand a problem, you really have to explore it from a whole variety of directions. And philosophers have a way of thinking intensely about a particular issue and come up with very good questions about things and can help direct what the neuroscientists will be doing. In my own experience, I've already done certain experiments that I wouldn't have even thought of doing if I hadn't interacted with one of the philosophers.
I think it depends on what you mean by free will. I think there is a number of different things people mean by free will. Some of them, I think, ultimately are not coherent. So I think some of what some people think have in mind looks to me like something like a square circle, a kind of thing that there just couldn't be. Sometimes what people have in mind, I think, would require us to not be worldly. So I don't think, and I think we're worldly. So I don't think we have that kind of free will. But some of what people have in mind by free will has to do with whether we can affect changes in the world in accordance with our own plans, and also whether we're such that we could be morally responsible.
I believe that we have free will. But if you ask me what I think, I'm not sure.
I think we have a certain kind of freedom. We're capable of voluntary action. Whether that's free will as some people conceive of it, probably not. Do we have free will as other people conceive of it? Yes. Do we have enough free will for moral institutions, for moral practice, for legal institutions? Yeah, I would say we do.
I do, but as I say, it's a complex notion. And so I think there are conceptions of free will that we don't have, certain dualist conceptions. But I think we have something which is recognizably what we mean when we're not ordinarily talking about free will.
No, I don't. I'm a fierce reductionist. I don't think there's any such thing as free will. I think we're nothing but a pack of neurons. I think all of our volitional decisions will ultimately be able to explain. We'll be able to explain all of them based on neurons and their interactions.
I think we have free will up to a point, but there are of course all kinds of perhaps even our unconscious factors, desires, feelings, all kinds of things can determine the content of our will. So personally, I think if we really want to become more free, we have to maybe through things like meditation, we have to really learn to become aware of the, even if you like, the deeper layers of the mind and kind of a self-knowledge. And in that sense, increase our degree of freedom of our will. And responsibility, of course, comes with it.
As I have said a number of times, my view is that it depends upon the definition.
We clearly have free will, but I think actually that particular question doesn't really require any neuroscientific input, because I do think that especially what has been meant by that question in the past is a question about the compatibility of free will and determinism, and we can sort that out on conceptual grounds. And I think, yeah, we can say in all confidence we have free will.
And I think it's an open question whether we have it. I don't know whether we do or not, so I'm neutral on that.
I don't think the question is well defined. As I said, there are numerous definitions of free will. I think in some sense, it's, as some people have explained the term, no, we don't have free will, as others have explained the term, yes, we do. For example, if you mean by free will that when someone is trying to make a decision between two alternatives, that person is able to perform both of the alternatives, yeah, in that sense I think we have free will. If you mean that there's some magical power to contravene the laws of nature, no, I don't think we have free will in that sense.
Do I think we have free will? Yes, I think we have free will.
So I think we have something. I want to understand what it is that we have. I think our actions are not merely reflexes triggered by the immediate sensory input, or at least not all our actions are like that. So I want to understand where those non-reflexive actions come from. Whether you then want to call them, quote, free will, unquote, that would be up to you. I think I probably would not use that term until I had to.
That's, of course, a difficult question. I think it depends on the definition of free will. If personally, I cannot see how we have some kind of very libertarian free will, where whenever there's a decision, the world stops, you step out of the world, you think about it, you make a decision, then the world continues and you move on. But I also do think that our conscious thoughts, wants, deliberations, decisions, and so on do affect our actions. So to that respect, I do think that we do have conscious control over our actions. So in that respect, I do think that we have free will. So it's, again, a nuanced answer to a nuanced question.
I don't know. I prefer not to say yes or no to a question that I have no good answer to. I hope that in the course of our investigation, I might have a better answer. But I think it heavily depends on how you define free will.
Well, that depends on what you mean by free will. I'm a philosopher. I've got to say that. So I think if free means free from causation, then no, I don't think we have free will, because none of our acts are free from causation. All of our acts are, in fact, caused. But if free means free from constraint, I get to do what I want to do, then we do have freedom in that sense. And so if you ask me, do we have free will or not, I got to ask you, what exactly do you mean by that? And then I can answer your question. But if you ask it in general, we're going to get nowhere.